I want to talk about resistance 2.0, or lack of better term, later. But I do want to talk about what's happening in DC in terms of the National Guard right now. Like what's it? I mean, I think you're in the DC suburbs, but what's it like there? Because I'm here in Louisville and I don't have a sense of it. Like, what is it like there right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, I think just to start off, it is infuriating and horrifying, and I think there's a lot of fear that folks are feeling. Folks, there's a lot of understanding that this is gonna be something that falls the first is just kind of like a direct attack on Black political power and on Black folks and people of color in the district that falls really heavily on you know, anybody who might be concerned about kind of an accelerated, like, stop and frisk approach to policing the entire city or the entire capital. So I think I've heard a lot of concern from folks around, like, what can I expect when I go outside? I know that we've seen some peaceful nonviolent clashes between different folks. Like last night, there was a group that set up and blocked a street on 14th and W, and crowds immediately appeared and chanted, "You're not welcome here," until they ultimately had to pack up and roll out. There's also just like an element of kind of ridiculousness to it, right? Like they're sending these like heavily armed people to police Georgetown. They're sending them to the National Mall. This is
These
security.
are not
It's
dangerous areas.
dangerous and it's
Georgetown is
also
not.
ridiculous.
Yes.
Yeah, so I would say that I think we're still getting a handle on exactly what is happening where. But it is this combination of both like very, very serious and should be understood as an extremely alarming escalation in an overarching power grab that stretches from the Texas redistricting to the attack on the census to the attack on DC to the threats to other cities. And also, that doesn't mean that like at every moment it's unfolding in that way.
And we had the National Guard in Los Angeles. I think they might still be there in some ways. So having the National Guard imposed on two of the most important cities in the country in a 3-month period is what dictators do, right?
Right. Well, and we know that he's threatening to do this to other cities, right? He is in his speech when he was talking about what he's doing in DC. He's talking about Chicago and Baltimore. He's talking, not notably black or cities with black mayors, perceived as majority black populations. Like it's a very clearly racialized attack, right? Like it's a very framed in terms of crime rates that have actually been falling for a long time or for several years in DC. All of this is like part of his overarching frame of kind of using immigration and racism as kind of like the ways in which the wedges with which he asserts control over the broader population.
I don't want to be too critical of her. It's an unusual situation, but the comments I've seen so far from Mayor Bowser have been like, we're going to work with them. I thought Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass were a little stronger in saying this is bad. I don't want to be too second guessing, but I'm concerned about her behavior. Are you concerned by how I don't want to say condoning this, but it's not active resistance. Maybe she has to
Yeah.
do this, but what do you think of what she's doing?
Absolutely concerned. And I think that, we've recognizing that DC is structurally in a different place than like a Los Angeles or a California. We are now trying to communicate a national story about what is happening. And it is a really big challenge if the mayor of DC is not actually communicating really clearly what an alarming and like terrifying incursion this is into DC local government and local affairs. And so, I don't think that's like a new thing for Muriel Bowser, right? Like, she
She's
has
probably
been
moderate. She's
a
probably pro-police.
posture. Yeah, well, and she's been trying to
Oh,
accommodate
right, right.
administration for a while, right? Like, think about like just even the symbolic removal of Black Lives Matter Plaza, right? She is trying very hard. She has been trying repeatedly to like reach an accommodation with the administration. I would look at. I would look at folks who are like on the council, like Robert White, look at Janice George. Those are the folks who might be like, speaking on behalf of DC residents with the level of alarm and urgency that a lot of us feel.
So when we talked in January, December, you sort of told me the resistance or opposing Trump would be different this time. There'd be fewer marches and different kinds of activities. So talk about how has that played out in the last few months? Like I think that's borne out, but I want to talk about what have the strategies you all have been using. There have been some marches, but what's the approach been to opposing Trump this time as opposed to opposing Trump last in 2017?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's a few big things. The first is, I think it's important to just name that in addition to like the hard power ways in which this is a different administration, right, comes in with a more consolidated Republican Party, comes in with a much stronger control over the courts. Um, We also saw this just massive collapse of elite institutions and elite actors as, once Trump won, right? Like you saw folks like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg rushing to kiss the ring. You saw universities like pushing, trying to make accommodations with them. You see all of these businesses preemptively dropping their DEI policies. You see, I can go the law firms. I can go down the list, right? That actually was that was a real shift in the dynamics, and it created kind of a series of dampening effects and like negative ripple effects as a lot of institutions that have some role in upholding either liberal democracy or even just their own interests and norms declined to do so. And we can talk about which ones did that because they believe in it, which ones did that because it's to their own advantage.
Hard
But
to figure out the difference in some ways. Yeah.
Right, and but it's interesting and important strategically. It's not like that interesting
Yes.
morally. It's all kind of functionally the same. But the anyway, so that was a really important kind of atmospheric shift, and so a lot of our own thinking shifted from kind of like, can we do one-offs focused on specific policies where we're mobilizing to try to push back on this policy to what do we need to do to build the mass public opposition to Donald Trump and then to show it in force in ways that are actually going to introduce into all of these alternate decision makers this question in their minds of like, is Donald Trump actually going to win, right? Because fundamentally what's happening is a bunch of like sections of society, their decision makers have said, well, Donald Trump is, he was elected, he won the popular vote, he's going to consolidate power. This is the new normal. I got to find my place underneath this new regime and I've got to like secure my position. And so I'm going to fold in and obey. And it's our job collectively as the resistance to kind of make people think maybe that's not actually going to happen. Maybe this is going to be a short-lived experiment in attempting to impose fascism that's going to end in a disaster for him and a historic wipeout for the Republican Party and an era of accountability and retribution and renewed democracy afterwards. And maybe they need to actually hedge their bets a little bit, right? And so part of the thinking as we shifted to stuff like hands off and no kings, which were obviously massive collective movement efforts, was we needed to have kind of we do need to do things where we're showing up for different issues, where we're showing up at different moments of crisis, but we also needed to collectively link arms and have kind of a big tent orientation to bringing out everyone who could collectively object to some part of what was going on and to show broad displeasure across the board. And so that was the thinking with Hands Off, which was oriented very much around reaction to the Doge cuts and to the attacks on so much of our services, federal government, civil rights, all of the pieces that were under attack there. That was the thinking with No Kings, which was kind of a broad anti-authoritarian, anti-overreach, because of the LA deployment, anti-immigration enforcement. Each of those protests, they were kind of oriented so that you could show up based on whatever brought you out. We were all showing up under the same umbrella to show a force of the supportive strength, and then oriented towards organizing people and moving them into longer term collective local organizing. Because fundamentally what we think is that we're pretty far down the path into authoritarian consolidation of power, and in that moment we've got to use the traditional tools that we've got. We've got to use our congressional advocacy. We've got to do our electoral work, but we also have to recognize that those things are not going to be sufficient. And what we are going to need is kind of mass civil resistance that targets not only kind of our elected officials, but actually every facet of power in American society and says, you have to take a side.
Let me ask a couple of follow-ups based on that. I guess the first thing I think you said was something along the lines of like, in 2017, it was useful to oppose like the healthcare bill because it was like one policy, and versus now the goal is maybe to oppose Trumpism writ large in a certain way because the situation is different. Is that what I would think? Is that kind of what you said?
Yeah, well, and I would say in general, like a lot of the model of protest in 2017 was kind of like something bad happens and we do a rapid response mobilization in response to it. And some of that was about pushing back on that specific thing, and some of it was just about kind of escalating the story more broadly. The way that harm has unfolded in this administration is so overlapping and so rapid and so catastrophic that like individual stories that would have prompted that level of backlash in 2017, they don't even get the front page treatment on day one, right? And so we actually kind of had to create overarching umbrellas that allowed us to collectively show up because like, I'll give the example. The Department of Education, they got rid of the Department of Education. That's crazy.
And did it
It
fairly
should be.
quickly and without much controversy, actually. Yeah, without
Yeah,
right.
exactly, and that's just because of, like, the sheer scale and speed at which they are moving as makes it really hard for individual stories to break through, so we have to, like, articulate collective meta stories that we all show up for instead. I mean, not that we don't also do things on the side, as well on different issues. I do think that there is strategic campaigning on particular things that are important for driving home the stories we need in order to build a bigger majority on our side, right? So we campaigned quite hard along with a lot of folks on the reconciliation bill, in part based on all kinds of evidence that it is a wildly disastrous bill for regular Americans and a massive transfer from normal people to the wealthy and to security services. That was a strategic decision both to try to stop and mitigate harm there, but also to make it as well known as possible. So there's still strategic advantage to doing that kind of campaigning. It's just that when we're actually thinking about how does the structure of protest work, right now we have to like build the biggest tent we possibly can to all push back together rather than saying we're going to come out on one issue and the one issue and one issue.
It's interesting you said the tent thing, because I guess when the No Kings and the hands-off protests were happening, there was also these fighting oligarchy rallies, and they had very large audiences as well. And I assume you oppose oligarchy. I know something about your politics, but in a certain way, I don't want to say there are Democrats who are for oligarchy, but I'm guessing that the No Kings, the whole party could agree to, versus fighting oligarchy with Bernie Sanders and AOC maybe is not as 100% unifying. Is that part of the right way to think about this?
That's an interesting question. We picked up No Kings in part because it was something that was emerging organically as a
Okay.
rallying cry. We saw this with the 5051 movement, which is this organic, or came out, movement that evolved out of the Reddit, a Reddit protest page. And we were seeing it resonate with a lot of folks and a lot of populations and able to express a sort of like, you're not the boss of me sentiment
Right.
that united the different kind of like factions of resistance and opposition to the Trump administration, and so we felt like it was a frame that could hold a lot. I do think there's like there's an ongoing. It was not like sorry. One of the things that then happened was that there was this side debate within the Democratic Party. There's like kings versus oligarchs, and we were
Right.
kind of like, oh,
Exactly.
we don't actually want to be part of that at all. We are
Yes.
also
Yes.
anti-oligarchy. We think that like an effective telling of the story of No Kings involves a really clear understanding that this is a guy who is raiding the government for his own self-interest and for the interest of his billionaire buddies, rather than a story that's like totally delinked from an economic analysis of what is going on. Um, what we did think was important about the King's frame, and kind of particularly in light of American history, is sort of the idea of somebody who's unaccountable, imperious, making decisions without your input, doing things that are going to harm you with no feedback mechanism, which can land as it relates to stories about corruption, as it relates to stories about billionaire giveaways, as it relates to stories about tariffs, which are a little bit of a complicated story to land. Um, Within some of the oligarchy frame, right? Because the oligarchy, like there's plenty of business interests that are not actually in favor of what they are doing on tariffs. And so the hope was that we can hold all of those within the No Kings frame, but it's definitely not intended to be like in opposition or in tension with the no oligarchy frame. And frankly, like I think a lot of the same people, a lot of regular people don't see any tension between these stories.
I agree with you, obviously. Okay, so we talked about elites, and I want to come back to them. But talking about the Democratic Party, like the first few months, all I could think about was, I think it was January 20th, January, that first week. Cory Booker, who I like and think is a good person, said something along the lines of like, "My job is not to oppose Donald Trump. My job is to help the people of New Jersey," and the implication being that I'm going to be I understand those words all seem true, but I worry the implication was problematic. And I think those first few months, it seemed like the senators were debating how many of us could vote for as many Trump nominees as possible. Do you think the Democratic Party has gotten further along in resisting from when they were on February 1st? Let's say, are they in the right posture now, or close to the right posture now?
Um, I think they're
Just okay,
closer,
closer. All
and
right. Yes.
also, my gosh, I think we've still got a long way to go.
Okay.
I think immediately after the election, there was just this. like kind of fervor that swept electeds within DC. This perception of kind of like we lost because we did not talk enough about lowering prices. The only thing we should, and Democrats went too far to the left, et cetera, et cetera. How they managed to get there, it's like a pretty tortured logic in my opinion. But the basic takeaway was sort of like we need to dial down the anti-Trump stuff, and we need to dial up, just saying lower prices, lower prices, lower prices, and everything else should be filtered through the frame of like this is a distraction from the real problem, which is the need for lower prices. And like that's just not a. I think it's a misread of how the media environment works in this moment. I think it's a misread because, you don't if you say something boring, you're not gonna travel and nobody's gonna hear you. So, like, you may be incredibly on message, but, like, if that message doesn't get beyond, you giving that quote to someone, it's not gonna matter. I also think it's just, like, a misread of how political conflict works, right? Like, we actually needed a fighting party out there on front making the case for why each individual terrible thing that Donald Trump was doing was bad in order to successfully catalyze the level of backlash because people take their cues from their electeds sometimes. And if they see electeds who are acting like things are mostly normal, then a lot of them will assume that things are mostly normal. Now, we were tapping into a backlash from basically November on and experiencing kind of this massive insurge of people who are saying like where is the leadership, what the hell is happening here. One of the very early signs of that was the Lake and Riley bill where we heard this was a immigration bill that was just extremely like it was a Republican mega messaging bill that got passed by Democrats in their desperation to look like or by a set of Democrats in their desperation to
Yes.
look like they were also cracking down on immigration. We saw a big backlash amongst our base. A lot of people and, continued pressure. Like we've got, Mark Warner at a town hall a couple months ago admitting that he shouldn't have voted for it. Like this is something that's going to continue to live on with folks. Um, I think Democrats they understand that they misread the base at this point. They understand that that's not where people are. I don't think they understand what to do about that. I don't think that they have any kind of like coherent analysis of what that means for how they operate. And I think frankly you can see that with the funding fight, right? Like we are not far out from a federal like an update a new funding fight, a like rerun of the March situation where Democrats in the Senate collapsed pretty ignominiously under Senator Schumer's leadership. And there's not a strategy right now. Like, we need a strategy, and if you had a party that kind of understood that their job is to use every lever that they have and to use, every tool in their toolbox, then you would be approaching this with a lot more clarity about how you use the one actual moment of power that you have the rest of this year.
We talked about elites at the beginning, newspapers, business owners. Is that story the same? I mean, I feel like I read about a college every week folding, but that maybe that those are the incentives there are hard, I would say. So how do you feel like as the elite capitulation declined, or is it at its highest low? Is it higher? I can't. That's hard for me to assess. But what's your sense of it?
I think it's continuing apace. I think we've got some examples of pushback, and I think we've got stuff we can build on. And also, I think you are seeing a bunch of stories of colleges folding. It is not an accident that they are trying to fold over the summer in order to avoid student-based backlash, right? And we'll see what happens when students get back in the fall. Um, but I think if you look at something like the CBS Paramount situation, right? Where Stephen Colbert's been pulled off the air, where there's been a deal with the administration. You see all of the different pieces of this, right? You see, corporate executives continuing to focus primarily on what's going to advance the short-term interests of their company. You see other, meaningful pushback that can have some culturally galvanizing effects, and also, we haven't yet altered the fundamental underlying incentives of folks like the CBS executives making these decisions.
What has happened positively like what have we resisted? Let me ask it that way. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's start with like a really big part of the threat in January, which was that you had an alliance between the richest man in the world and Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, right? And you had this kind of fusion of an entire strain of kind of tech anti-democracy thought with the kind of like right-wing MAGA uh, anti-democracy thought. And one of the things that we identified very early on within the ecosystem was that there was going to be this, we desperately needed to either fracture that alliance or create major political costs for that alliance. And so one of the very early strategic moves that a bunch of us made were to focus in on Elon Musk and his role in federal government, recognizing that uh, he had a totally different set of like assumptions, favorables, et cetera, attached that caused people to like have less trust in what he was doing and use that as an entree into driving down the favorability of Republicans more broadly. Culminating in both Musk seeing his own interests directly impeded by protests at Tesla dealerships, but also culminating in the defeat of his preferred candidate in April with the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. And so, I think the combination of like protest as part of the way that we both drove down administration and Musk approval ratings, and also created the conditions in which that relationship could fracture. That's a really big deal, and, it's easy the move cycle moves so fast at this point that it's easy to kind of be like, "Oh, that was ancient history," but the basic premise of, like, the richest man in the world is, like, lockstep with and basically living out of the White House with the president, and they're both implementing this incredibly terrifying agenda together. That was, like, existential threat level, and we are now in a position where that relationship is fractured and Musk has withdrawn to I don't even know what he's doing now, but he's withdrawn, to a meaningful degree, and so, I think that's a really big win. That's, like, a really important part of the overall picture that, um, we were actually able to fracture that alliance, and, Republicans still have a massive money advantage, they will for the foreseeable future, but it's categorically different than having a supervillain, Bond villain situation on your side.
Let me ask, I think in terms of numbers a lot. So what I feel like by this time in 2017, the generic ballot numbers, well, there were a lot of evidence suggesting the Democratic Party would win the midterms and that Trump was fairly unpopular. It doesn't feel Trump's numbers are not great, but they're not at, the worst levels possible despite him being so horrible. Trump's poll numbers are not that bad. And the Democratic Party is very, very unfavorably viewed right now. Like, what do we make of those? So those two data points worry me, but I think there's reasons maybe I shouldn't be too worried. But how do you view those two data points?
Well, I mean, first, I would say Trump's approval ratings are pretty bad. Like
Okay.
they're objectively, you want to be above 40% consistently if you are a
Yeah.
president, right? And also agree, Democrats' approval ratings are also pretty bad. It's worth noting a big part of that is actually because Democrats are mad at Democrats, and so that is
Because
important,
of the
but it is
folding, we're criticizing because you think that's because of the lack of urgency and fight.
Yeah, I think there's, frustration with Democrats on kind of like the leadership gap. I think there's frustration with Democrats for having lost 2024. I think that a lot of what's happening in the current moment is kind of an anti-gerontocracy backlash that is a delayed reaction to, the Biden decision to run again and the fact that we were all put in this situation in 2024 with him having to step down and Kamala Harris having to step in on the very last minute. Um so I think there's like when you dig into like who is mad at Democrats, they don't have great ratings with anyone, but part of the reason why their ratings are so bad is because actually like deeply committed Democrats are also quite frustrated with Democratic leadership. Um, I think that it's going to be really, really important for us to figure out ways to make the story of both the primaries and the general election of 2026 about something that's more than what it's currently shaping up to be. I think that we have this basic challenge, particularly where like Donald Trump is the most historically and shockingly corrupt uh, president in history, and we ought to be able to capitalize on that. And we actually really struggle to do so because people, when you look at the polling, people think that both sides are corrupt and Republicans are just better at it. Um, I don't think that that's the kind, and we also have like a real like kind of like feasibility credibility gap with Democrats where we've got policies that test really well with people, and we also have like a lack of trust that Democrats will actually enact and do those things. And so my takeaway from all of that is that you actually kind of have to have a step back and have a real orientation around how can Democrats rebrand themselves as people who mean business and who are making tangible demonstrations to show that they mean business. And some of that's going to be about primary challenges, right? There's going to be some set of people who are like clearing out folks who are not on board. Um, but I also think we should be thinking about like what are tangible commitments that we could make about our relationship with money, our relation, with corporate money, our relationship with money in politics, the ways in which Democrats do business that can give people some reason to think that there's like there's going to be something different about how people operate once they're back in, because we're fighting Republicans, but honestly, at this point, we're also just fighting people's total distrust and disenchantment with the system.
I wanted all in here because I wanted to ask a question about what the Democrats should do. We've kind of talked around that, but I guess you're saying rebrand. I worry that we're having intense debates about housing regulations in
Yeah,
California and in New York. I don't know how. I'm not saying those are not important, but I worry we're in this sort of Medicare. I don't. I
yeah,
Medicare for all versus Medicare for more. I think some of these details, but I think what you're saying is the rebrand should be around kind of popular, kind of corporate consolidate. The rebrand
yeah.
should be along different lines than sort of center left versus. It's not an ideological rebrand or necessarily a is that what you're getting at? Tell me what your framing is a little bit different, I think, in terms of like money in politics. Is that what you're getting, the kind of issues you're getting at?
Yeah, a little bit. So I guess what I'd say is, I think there's definitely a very lively debate about abundance and housing policy, and somehow that's gotten tied up in the debate about moderation on Twitter. And it's almost impossible for me to stress how disconnected that is from anyone who is doing like actual anti-Trump organizing on the
Yes,
ground.
that's what I
I
understand.
host a weekly like Q&A with our folks, and we've got like thousands, 5,000 people join, and they upvote all the questions. I have never once gotten a single question making it in, above the like hundreds on any of this stuff. And so I think there's a whole conversation there, and it's just hard to stress how disconnected it is from the actual concerns of the kinds of people who might be, who might actually take up some of that policy because they just view it as like not relevant to the current moment. The current moment, the question is, what are you doing to stop fascism? Um, and in terms of like what Democrats can,
Yeah, what
like,
does a stopping fascism agenda look like? That might be the
yeah,
question I'm sort of driving at
yeah.
here.
Well,
Yes.
so I mean, I think part of it would be like real and aggressive commitments around accountability and investigations, right? Like, we don't yet have any commitments from Democrats about what they will do with the House investigative powers if they win a majority, right? So like part of it is like for the base, part of it is like literally, if we put you into power, will you do something differently than you've done this year? Because what we've seen you do this year is fumble the ball when you actually have meaningful leverage. So there's one piece that's that. I think that there's also a piece about like what's the set of policies and the set of commitments that break through to people who are fundamentally disenchanted with the broader, like the two-party system, with government as a whole, who don't have any faith in, even if they like Democrats, don't have much faith in their policies. I think there's like a very significant overlap with people who are deeply distrustful of Democrats after following the Biden administration's mishandling of Gaza. Like, there's this whole kind of like set of questions around how do you reach people who are actually simply just not. It's not about just saying a policy that they like. It's about giving them some reason to believe that this time is going to be different. Um, and my position, my take here is like, you can't just promise new policies when you get into power, knowing that you're also not going to actually have the majorities to make that happen. You actually have to change something right now about how you are doing business in order to signal that you're going to be different this time around. And so, what's within our control right now? What's within our control is how we use money to advance our own interests. What's within our own control is like our relationships with lobbyists and with corporate interests. What's within our own control is like, are we actually unilaterally stepping back, like cleaning our own house on stock trading? Like, how do we actually signal to people that there is a real and genuine and substantive difference between how the Democratic Party treats corruption within its own ranks versus how the Republican Party treats corruption? So that would be my pitch for like, think about the things that are within our own control that we can do differently without federal levers of power, because we're not going to have them on the timeline that's necessary to convince people that they need to believe in us again.
And I guess I've been dubious. I've been a little skeptical of the run younger candidates because a young person is not inherently better than an old person. Bernie Sanders is great. We could name some members of Congress who I don't love who are young, but I think the point you're making is like if you wanted the party to to feel different to people, it has to be different in some way, and younger people or newer people might be part of that. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely part of it. I think the generational fight right now is a double-edged sword. Like, it is not a win to me to replace like Jerry Nadler with somebody who is run by, who's getting funded by DMFI, right? And so, and also, net net. it is better to have newer faces. We have like a lot of data suggesting that the current faces representing the Democratic Party are not causing people to have more faith in the Democratic Party. Like, with all due respect to Senator Schumer, he has an approval rating that is I can't even call it up to mine, but it is not the kind of thing where anybody is gonna um he's not gonna be welcome on any stump state or in any swing state, let's put it that way. So, like, I think there is a piece of this that is absolutely about running younger people, running people who are more accessible, running people who are digital media natives, like running people who are, capable of communicating with voters in the ways that voters actually are willing to hear right now. Because it's not just having press releases and, interacting with your your traditional legacy media. It's like, can you actually, can you do a TikTok and do you look like you're doing it willingly and not in a hostage video, right? Like, it's just, so I absolutely think there is like a generational element to it. And I also think we got to be careful about just a purely generational element without like a clear overlay of like, we're trying to clean a house here. Like, this hasn't been working. We need to do things differently.
And I'll end it there. Anything you want to sort of, I think the word plug is wrong. Any way people can plug into Indivisible groups, or talk about how, if you're in Community X and you want to get more involved, what you can do through Indivisible.
Yeah, absolutely. So Indivisible is a nationwide movement. We have local groups all over the country. There are about 2,800 of them right now. So there's probably one that is near you. If there is not one that is near you, congratulations. You might just be the new founder of an Indivisible group. If you go to indivisible.org, you can find where local groups are. You can sign up for our emails, and we will send you updates, including when events are happening in your area that you can attend, as well as like regular actions that you can take. And yeah, just encourage you to find a local organizing home, whether that's Indivisible or somewhere else.
Okay, well, I'll finish up there. Leah, thanks for joining us. More importantly, thank you for all the work you've been doing.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Bye bye.
Bye.
And we'll end there.